Welcome back. I'm here with my guest, Rabia Khidr. She's the founder and executive director of Canadian Association of Muslims with Disabilities. Again, welcome, Rabia. We left it at education, and you mentioned something actually about a positive thing, and I believe education starts at a very early age. Could you give us some examples, for instance?
Definitely. See, even around any form of attitudes, discriminatory attitudes toward differences, all of that begins at a very young age, introduced by the environment, by adults around us. So children today, when they're exposed to people with disabilities right in their classrooms, you know, there are children with and without disabilities in the same classroom, they're learning together. Their attitudes are very different today toward people with disabilities. So people under 30 see people with disabilities very differently today than the older generations do.
True. That's true. And I come in also, I wasn't born in Canada, but I was born overseas. And I tell you the truth, it is way better here. And this is something to be acknowledged, as Prophet Muhammad said, whoever does not show gratitude to people does not show gratitude to God. Indeed, here, the people with disabilities are more honored, their dignity is preserved.
Well, Imam, on a personal level, I mean, I can attest to that. I'm not born here either, but I came here at a very young age. And I think that was a blessing from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that I grew up here in this society, because this society gave me opportunities to education, opportunities to employment, opportunities to be able to show my abilities so I can have a family, I can have children, I can be a contributing citizen in the society.
Indeed, and you are a very successful person, and this is why we should emphasize. Sometimes we have too much theory and talk, but talk is cheap. Action. Well, this is one of the great blessings in this country, because there is a lot of action more than talk, whereas sometimes we say a lot, but we do less. Now, we want to focus on this legislation. What is this legislation about accessibility?
Well, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act came into effect in 2005, essentially to make sure that people with disabilities have more and more access in the public domain. And by 2025, Ontario is to be barrier-free, meaning applying principles of universal design and shifting attitudes to make sure that people with disabilities are included fully in our society.
We had a gentleman earlier who was here, Aaron Spodek, and he's actually with RENA, an organization which works
with people with developmental disabilities. Yes.
And let's hear what he says about this legislation.
RENA is a faith-based developmental service agency servicing people with developmental disabilities in the Toronto area and York region, as well as a few other regions in the province. About a year ago, RENA began a project in partnership with the Ministry of Community and Social Services to develop a model for places of worship to implement new legislation on accessibility for people with disabilities into those places of worship. The Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act was passed in 2005. And as I said, there has a comprehensive goal of making Ontario accessible to people with a full range of disabilities by the year 2025. The first set of regulations under the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act is the Accessibility Standards for Customer Service. Now, this document is a compliance manual for small businesses and organizations, and outlines a step-by-step process by which those organizations can comply with the legislation. There are 8 requirements of the legislation, and they're as follows: to develop policies, practices, and procedures for people with disabilities, to have training for all staff and volunteers that provide services on behalf of an organization, to have a feedback process where people with disabilities can give feedback on the accessibility of their experience, to have communications to clients and customers and congregants that is accessible for people with the full range of disabilities, to allow service animals and support persons onto the premises, as well as to have notice of temporary disruptions of service in cases where an elevator is not working or an escalator stops working, as well as documentation requirement for any organization with 20 or more employees. And this piece of legislation will be coming into effect for the public sector, so for government offices, very soon, in January 1st, 2010. The private and non-for-profit sector, of which places of worship fall into that category, will have to comply by January 1st, 2012.
Well, CAMD is here to assist the Muslim community in ensuring that it's complying with that legislation. It's prepared to comply by the time the legislation is a requirement in, as Aaron said earlier, January 1st, 2012. So we have 2 years and we have a lot of work to do.
So a lot of mosques, for instance, in our community, it's a legislation and they have to comply with this.
They absolutely have to comply. There are more standards that will be rolling out. There's a whole slew of things that have to be done, not just in terms of physical accessibility, meaning having ramps and elevators and automatic doors and designated parking and accessible washrooms and appropriate lighting, but also having their materials, written literature accessible, having customer service accessible with the right attitude.
So when you say the literature, that for instance, Braille and all these things?
Braille, audio, large print, and this is where we're here to assist the community. We're here as a resource. We have the expertise to help the community implement this legislation effectively.
Do you think the Muslim communities of Canada are ready for it?
No, but we can certainly help them get ready for it. And that's where, you know, to begin the process, we're asking the community to dedicate their khutbahs on December 4th on the topic of Islam and the Islamic tradition around disability rights. The international community observes International Day of the Disabled Person under the UN on December 3rd. And this year, for the first time, we're trying to mobilize the community, the Muslim community, to do the same, and Jumu'ah falling on December 4th.
Indeed. Well, we're actually spreading the message, and we should work towards that. Rabia, your last words, just as we're trying to wrap up this discussion towards an inclusive society. Any thoughts?
Well, we need to keep in mind, and we have a little poster campaign that we've been promoting, that we're all created equal by God, the most glorious, some of us with disabilities, some of us without. As equal members of our communities, we have the right to live with dignity and respect.
Indeed.
And, you know, toward an inclusive ummah, nothing about us without us.
Oh, that's beautiful, and it's a good way to wrap up this discussion. Many of us may have disabilities we don't know of, so we ask God to bless your work and keep up the good job. Dear viewers, for any comments or suggestions, do not hesitate to email us at info@faithoflife.net. Until next time, I wish you all the best. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be with you.